We're going to talk about on Node.js. So, Node.js, woo! Ryan Dahl and crew. More on that in a minute. If I don't get back to that within 5 slides or so, remind me. Somebody just say Ryan Dahl. Okay. So, the prelude. So this is the part where, by the end of this, I should reference back to Ryan Dahl. So the prelude here, before we actually get started, is this is my belief about Node.js, generally speaking. If you don't have a really good reason to be using Rust, because Rust is performant, and Rust is perfect, and Rust is this, that, and the other, and if you ever come into somebody that uses Rust, they're probably going to take you hostage and make you write Rust, and heaven forbid that they get you into a macro or something. But Rust is good, Rust is cool, but unless you have a really good reason to be using Rust, which there are many, I do not deny that there are, you should almost certainly be using Go. This is not a bait and switch, I promise, but this is the truth. So I'm being 100% serious about this, so let's take the humor away. You should either be writing your code in Rust or Go. Rust if you are bound to single core performance, Go if you are not. If you have to integrate vertically, and that's the only direction you can go, Rust is a good solution that will generate safe, reliable code. If you can scale horizontally, if you're not doing gaming, if you're not doing some type of machine learning, then you should be using Go. Go is, the entire internet was rewritten in Go for a reason. It's performant, it's reliable, it's a great language, and it will help you to be better as a programmer in other languages. That said, for some reason, you have chosen Node. So why would I say this? Why would I say that the 2 options you should be looking at are Rust and Go? And I'm here to teach people about Node, and I will be teaching you about Node. It is a dumpster, and it is on fire. Node is a dumpster fire. And I love JavaScript. I love JavaScript. Okay. It's bigger than that. He asked if it was NPM or Node. It's bigger than that. Okay. So this is the reason that just JavaScript in general. JavaScript in general, everything, I should have put in the little Lion King thing. You see off in the horizon, Simba? Everything the JavaScript touches are the Badlands. But there's a reason for this, and it's not JavaScript's fault. At least that's my claim. So Microsoft has tried time and time and time and time again to figure out how to repurpose its C# developers to do something people actually care about. And that's, I mean, look at the Wikipedia page for TypeScript. TypeScript is not built as a language. The marketing is, okay, we got TypeScript, and TypeScript is just JavaScript, but we're adding types, except that you're not adding the types that JavaScript has. You're actually taking C# and writing a scripting language that happens to you can coerce it into JavaScript. Maybe more on that later. Yehuda Katz. If I remember correctly, we had him on JavaScript Jabber. If I remember correctly, I was bashing on the import syntax and said, what kind of idiot would have done this? And he said, hey, I worked on that spec. He is a Ruby guy. He does not like JavaScript. He is one of the head guys in the Ember framework. Does not like JavaScript, okay? CoffeeScript. As soon as Node became popular, the day Node was announced, CoffeeScript. The Ruby people, okay? Elm is all the hot mess right now. Elm comes from Erlang. It's Elixir. That's what Elm is, okay? JSX was inspired by OCaml. And more on that in a second. And then you've got just straight up ignorance, which I won't go to this right now, but if you want to see pure stupidity at the highest level of control, look at these slides and click on that link. And what? you will have either a laughing time or a crying time. But there's a discussion that's 50 comments long, and I reopened it after 7 years by re-clarifying everything I could, and I'm not going to go into it. I'm not going to, the TC39 is, it's not people who work on or like JavaScript necessarily. There are people in TC39 who work on JavaScript. Most of them don't like it. And there are people on TC39 that, as far as I can reason, have never written a line of JavaScript. I don't know what they're doing there. But okay, so there's all that. So the reason it's a dumpster fire is we've got too many cooks in the kitchen. Too many people want too many different things, and instead of, it's kind of mutually assured destruction, except they're just pushing the red button all the way. Everybody's letting off their nukes. They say that there's no horse trading. They defend that to the death. I don't know how you can look at what's happened to the language. Horse trading is when you say, okay, if you pass my spec, I'll pass your spec. I don't know how that could not be true based on the way the language has evolved. And then this is, okay, I'm paraphrasing, but the creator of React essentially said the problem with React is JavaScript, and that he wants to replace it with Reason, which is OCaml. And I'm not going to play the clip here, but you can watch it if you want. He kind of says it in more flowery words, but that's what he says. Okay? And so we have this problem of if you stand for nothing, you will fall for anything. There is no identifiable community in JavaScript. There's a JSX community, there's an Elm community, there's a TypeScript community. I have not been able to discern if there's actually a JavaScript community within JavaScript. I thought that this captured it pretty well. I really don't understand the argument for making the JS engine ignore certain areas of code forever. We cannot undo this. This is in relation to a recent proposal to overlay TypeScript on JavaScript, because it would bring TypeScript users back into JS without a compiler, which I don't necessarily think it, we'll see. Why is it ECMAScript's job to look more like your language? You know, this is the thing. Everybody hates JavaScript. Everybody wants JavaScript to be something different, which makes it really hard to learn the benefits of JavaScript, which is one of the reasons I say if you want to learn JavaScript, learn Go, because you will learn more about JavaScript from writing Go than you will learn from writing JavaScript, because Go is actually written in the style of JavaScript. If you compare the two languages at their core, before they started just going off the deep end, you can essentially write Go code in JavaScript and feel good about it. Now, that's what I'm going to. That's part of what I'm going to show you. And then you just have this problem of people repeating the same problems over and over and over again. This is across the industry. We like to reinvent the wheel. One of the problems with good solutions is that they're not very controversial, so they don't generate a lot of hype. So when somebody comes out with an argument that's completely well-reasoned, that's easy to understand, that clarifies all the necessary points and doesn't leave a lot of room for ambiguity, it just falls flat because no one cares. You're not going to get 1,000 retweets on something that makes sense and is non-controversial. And Russ Cox here, kind of not exactly in the vein of what I was saying, but the NPM attack that, well, there's been several NPM attacks over the last 6 months or so. But basically, this is a solved problem. The problem that NPM is having is not a problem that we actually need to have. It's amazing that it took the Go authors so long to, you can watch his talk on dependency, but it's about Go, but it doesn't matter. It is a talk on all solvable problems with dependency chain management. And he goes through each argument and he shows how it works out, and he graphs A to B to C, and he shows, well, if you follow this paradigm, you get this. If you follow this paradigm, you get that. And then in the end, you can take the path with the fewest trade-offs. There is a path that has the fewest trade-offs. It is the most perfect path. There is not a better path you can take. And NPM could do it, but they're not going to. And so this is what this leaves us with, right? Okay. So this is me. This is an interview with me the other day.
It's JavaScript. I love it. No, I don't recommend it. Well, that was a...
So I really do love JavaScript. I really do. I think it's a great language. I think it's a powerful language. That's why I'm here today. But it's a minefield, and it's a minefield because people make bad choices, and I don't know why they keep making them. Once you realize it's bad, you should stop. Like what the guy John was saying, you know, if you realize this is a red flag, then go the other way a little bit, huh? Okay, so that all aside, so why you know TypeScript? And it's because of this reason. Well, in addition to that, TypeScript is actually a scripting language for C#, not a scripting language for, not an enhancement to JavaScript. It's when you mix two complex things together, you get the product of their demerits, not the sum of their benefits, right? So if you've got something with problems over here, it's like marriage, right? A lot of people in this room have been married. Probably half of you, maybe not that, hopefully, you know, a quarter of you have been divorced. When you take two people with issues and you put them together, all of a sudden you have more issues than either of you had together total, you know, independently. And that's what this is with the programming language stuff is, and some of you, I think, may have experienced this with TypeScript already, that when you try to add all of these systems on top of JavaScript that it wasn't designed for, and you try to force them in, and you try to ignore the systems that JavaScript was designed for, you end up with a really complicated ball of wax. Okay, so before I go on to the gems, because this is where we're going to have a good time, hopefully. But I did want to mention back again to the Go comment and the Go and Rust comment. Does anybody know where Ryan Dahl and basically everybody except for me who was in, well, I wasn't in the clique or anything, but you know, everybody that was in the early Node community, do you know where they are now? Ryan Dahl is writing Rust. A lot of the other ones are writing Rust. Half of them are writing Go. They either went to Go or Rust. They got out of college. They grew up. They learned the same stuff that all these people are saying, and they said, holy crap, I made a mess I can't fix. In Ryan Dahl's case, he said, okay, I'm starting over. That's what Dino is. Dino is written in Rust. It's Rust C++ bindings to V8. Or they went over to Go and said, oh my goodness, now I don't have to deal with all of that crap that I accidentally created by mistake, not knowing what I was doing. The rest of us have to live with it. So they got off scot-free. They get to go play in their fun land, and we have to deal with the mess that they left behind. And this is true. You can go look at their GitHub profiles. The people that were the original Go authors, most of them are not there anymore. Most of them have moved to one of those. So anyway, so now let's get to the good parts where I quit being whiny and be a cool AJ86 instead. So first thing, this is really a minor note, but I want to start off this way because if we're going to talk about Node, first thing that we should talk about is how to get it installed correctly, because this is something that amazingly has not been solved well in the general case. So I, along with a few other devs, run a project called webinstall.dev. And I guarantee you, I will personally refund you your money if you do not find it to be the best system for installing your developer tools that you have ever encountered, whether you're on Windows, Mac, or Linux. So the problem with the Node installer, this actually uses the Node installer. It uses the official installer, but it uses the tar package rather than the exe or the pkg. And the reason for this is if you're on Windows, then it's going to require administrative privileges to install, and it's going to get stuck in places where you don't want it to be stuck into, okay? And I don't know that much about the problems on Windows because I don't use Windows that often, but I've made sure that this works on Windows without administrative privileges. The path works. Everything's great, okay? And it's the official installer. It's not special tweaks. There is one special tweak that's across the board, but it's just an npmrc config, and it's just because there's a bug that they chose not to fix for backwards compatibility, and it has to do with the paths of Node executables, and you probably will never run into it, but if you do, it will never be the problem that the change I made in the config file hurt you. It'll be that it helped you because no one would want, by default, it to select random paths for the Node path. If you have 2 versions or 3 versions of Node install, you would want it to use the same one that it started running. Just to explain it is too complicated. I'll shut up now. Okay, so then on Mac, the problem is if you use the pkg installer, and many of you have done this, then it messes up your permissions on your user local directory. So then when you go to do other stuff, then it says, access denied, you try to npm, you install something else, some other developer tool, and then you run npm install, and now all of a sudden npm install says access denied. Has anybody had this problem? Okay, yeah. Okay, so you get that problem. And then if you install it via Brew, well, your first problem is Brew, right? You have to literally download 500 megabytes of useless nonsense so that you can get a 50 megabyte developer tool. And then the problem with Brew is it has all these dependencies, and they also go into your system paths, and it doesn't cause permission conflicts, but what will eventually happen, I almost guarantee you, because anybody that's run Brew without doing people that update Brew every day, they don't have this problem. I'll give you that. But eventually you'll run into this problem with Brew where libSSL, because libSSL doesn't follow semantic versioning, it has version 1.2.10q, stuff like that. What will happen is two incompatible versions of libSSL will be in the same path together because of the way that Brew puts stuff in the path that's at a system level as opposed to at a user level. And then things like SSH will stop working or curl will stop working, and it's because it's finding a library in the path. So Brew creates its own problems aside from the fact that it's ridiculously slow. And then if you're on Linux, if you try to use apt, anybody that's tried, then you got the permission problems. And then instead of getting node 16, you're getting node v10. Anybody had this problem on Linux? You don't use Linux? Okay, you use Linux. But you don't have this problem. Oh, good for you. Oh, okay. Yeah, because apt is okay for system utilities if you want to run desktop Linux. It's not okay for developer utilities. So anyway, that whole spiel is just to say, if you use webinstall.dev, you can actually use webinstall.dev to install Brew. The Brew commands will run longer because it will have to recompile things that it would otherwise be able to get as, what do they call it, casket files. But it will all be in your user directory, so it will never come into conflict with your system paths and your system utilities. But Node, PyEnv, tons of tools on webinstall.dev. If there's anything there that ought to be there that isn't there, just let me know, and we will eventually get it on. But this, I know I'm the author of this, so it's like, oh, of course you're going to say it's the best. But there's a legitimate problem, and I promise you, if you use this, you will not have those permission problems, those install problems, etc. Assuming that your system isn't already hosed from something else to begin with, because if your computer's broken, this won't fix your computer for you. But it will get rid of that problem where, once a year and a half, you actually have to reinstall macOS because you just can't figure out why things aren't working well. This helps with that. So, yeah, I don't know about Mac ports at all. I can't speak to that. And it's also better than NVM, because NVM, when you install a tool such as Prettier or JS Hint, NVM tries, for convenience, it tries to give you the same packages across the installs. So when you switch between one version of NVM and another, you can run Prettier, for example, or ESLint or whatever. But because it doesn't keep separate installs, whenever there's an incompatibility between a version of Node and a package, then that breaks. And so this actually fixes that problem as well, because everything is installed into its own local opt directory. And so the versions of Node never come into conflict with one another. Now, there's probably some problems that it doesn't solve, but it solves all of the problems that I've personally encountered, or any of the people that I personally work with have encountered, because we've made sure that it does. So, take it or leave it, but at least try it out. I think I just caught, yeah. So we're back to less is more. Okay, so that's first thing is get it installed right, get past the install problems. And actually, let me open up the floor real quick for any questions. If there's anything that you'd like to know about Node paths, the npmrc, how Node is installed, anything about the internals of that process, I'm just going to go ahead and say, ask me right now. If you've had a problem and you want to know, how do I go about solving this, I most likely can tell you. Or curiosity. Okay, it's not that interesting of a subject, so I'll move on. All right, so we're back to less is more, okay? So y'all have all heard of JavaScript, the good parts, I assume. If you haven't, it's such a meme. Good for you for staying off the internet and focusing on code. But JavaScript, there's JavaScript, the definitive guide, the book on the left. Yes, it is your left as well. And JavaScript, the good parts, the book on the right. The difference is that one is very tiny and the other is very big. Yeah. But then if you add in ECMAScript, you got a whole new problem. But the point here is that the language JavaScript is growing and growing and growing and growing. We don't have to use it. As Douglas Crawford says, you're not paid to use every feature of the language. You are paid to write correct programs. So if you have a choice of tools and one of them works better and more consistently, why would you ever choose the other tool? This just doesn't make sense. I agree. So that's the first thing. Now, how can we slice off the language so that we can use less of it and apply the principles that we've been talking about? So this is where I want to spend a good chunk of time on this. I want to have questions. I'm expecting that some of this will be intuitive, some of it's not going to be intuitive. If you have a dumb question, the time to ask it will be as soon as it comes into your head and you've had about 15 seconds to process it to make sure that it isn't actually a dumb question. Because as we progress, you're going to sound dumber and dumber if you come up and ask it later. So it's to your advantage to be dumb quicker so that you end up smarter. Huh? Okay, so I want to introduce to you the concept of classes, which of course does not go with TypeScript, but we can talk about this. I know you've got some questions about TypeScript, and I did a presentation specifically on this topic, which again, all the links, I put everything in here, so if you crawl through this, you can get them all. And that's this, and we're not gonna watch that. Well, actually, no, I have a little segment here. I don't know what this is about, but we're gonna watch this segment. I don't remember what it is. And so JavaScript prototypes are actually, there's this whole appropriation thing that happened where the term prototype got appropriated to mean class, which is not what it's intended for, and then we had to come up with this new term for what prototypes actually are, and it's called polyfills. So if you ever heard the term polyfill, that's what prototypes are for. They are for backporting features into the language that are ratified in standards before browser manufacturers can update to release them.
I.e. love them.
Okay, yeah, that's why that clip is in there. Because a lot of people think, oh, JavaScript has always had classes, they were called prototypes. False. JavaScript was designed in such a way that the language itself was to be extensible so that as browsers adopted JavaScript, additions could be made to the specification and the users could polyfill to make JavaScript match the specification ahead of the browser release schedule. It's in the name, prototype, right? So that was the first abuse there. So going back to our principles, flat is better than nested. We want to avoid classes because they tend to give us lots of hierarchy. Now you can create complex hierarchy without classes. Believe me, I've done it. But classes tend to encourage you into this mode of thinking. You're intentionally thinking about polymorphism, inheritance, and how can I make this, because I need to don't repeat myself and I need to share a similar functionality and it gets you in that mode. So we want to get out of that. So flat is better than nested. This is one reason we don't want to use classes. Another reason we don't want to use classes, because what do we do with JSON? What do we do with JavaScript? We want to send data back and forth across the network all the flipping time, right? So we want to get this JSON over to our server. We want to get the JSON to the browser. We want to save the JSON in the database, right? Maybe you're getting JSON going into Mongo. Maybe you're getting JSON going into HStore and Postgres. But we like JSON, we really do. And so it's an ideal principle to be able to say we can dehydrate JSON and serialize it, and then we can rehydrate JSON into a functional object that does what we need it to do. I imagine that this is a very difficult case for me to explain or show an example of because the way that it is. But I imagine many of you have run into cases where you want to either save information about an object or you want to get an object back into its previous state. Could be because of a page reload or database, whatever. And then you end up writing all this funky wrapper mess to try to poke. You got to instantiate the object, but then you got to go call a bunch of setters, and you got to get all the internal state right. If we just try to eliminate the classes and try to focus on JSON, then we get what we wanted the whole time, which is the ability to transmit data back and forth and store it and rehydrate it, et cetera, et cetera. And then also, we avoid shallow abstractions and a lot of the syntax mess. So much of the syntax mess has come about to try to sugarcoat prototypes and try to have, we've got 5 different ways now, and they're basically doing syntax sugar now. It's not standardized yet, but if you're using React, you've seen this, where there are private properties of a class, which is the exact same thing as having a closure. We'll see that in just a second. I'm talking too much. Okay, so here's our starting point for this. And this is where we're first going to have our questions, because some of you have never seen this before. You can take module.exports, and you can just assign that to a variable. And that can be your starting point for your package. So instead of classes, think packages. So questions about this right here. And I don't believe that there are no questions about this. So in Node, if you want to be able to use require, I mean, is this hypothetical, or you really don't know what this is? Okay, oh, because you're using TypeScript, so you've not used the JavaScript way of doing this before. Ah, right? Okay, so in JavaScript and Node, there is a special thing called module, and it has some information about the current file, essentially. So the current file, the current .js file, is the module. And the exports is the object that when you do a require on the other side, the exports is what you are requiring. So if you assign exports to a nice name, such as person, then you, in your code, you can be looking at person.this, person.that, person.whatever, and whatever you are attaching to the person object is what is going to be included. So on this side, you say var person equals module.exports. You're declaring your person package. On the other side, which maybe I should go ahead and just make sure, because you may not have actually seen this. I wasn't thinking about that, but that makes sense, because TypeScript kind of discourages you from using native JavaScript. So on the other side, it would be person equals require, and then /person.js, like this. And so it's just the mechanism by which you transfer. So thank you for asking that. I appreciate that very much. Is there any clarification that anyone would like on that? And you pretty much, the only reason that you actually ever use module, because you could actually just say var person equals exports, and that's actually what I recommend. I just did this out of muscle memory. The only case that you ever actually need to do module is because all of this Webpack and Babel and yada, 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 you need to test if module exists to know whether your code is in a browser as vanilla JavaScript or whether it is in either Node or a packaging system. So I might show that later. If somebody wants to remind me, I can show that little piece, but it just helps you write code that will work both in Node and browsers. You can just do a check to see if module exports is defined, essentially, or if module is defined. And if module is defined, you know you can use exports. Okay, so I'll move on from that. So here's a this-less constructor. So again, just like it was said earlier, all of this stuff it's kind of syntax sugar, one thing for the other. This is, I believe, the simplest form of creating a constructor in JavaScript, is just having a create method. So we have our person.create, and we're passing in p representing the initialization of the person. So we want to initialize this person with a name, with an age, maybe with some other things. And you could do this in different ways. How I do it in my code is I often use whatever's passed in as the initial value. I often modify that. I normalize the data. If they're missing an age, I set their age to 0. If they're missing some piece of information that I can set as a default, I'll go ahead and initialize that to its default or 0 value, and then I'll return that same object. So hopefully that in and of itself is clear. You could either be creating a copy of the object and initializing the copy, or you could be taking the object itself and initializing the object itself. Either way, I think in most cases you want to be returning that object. And now there's no this here. There's nothing magical about it. It's plain objects, plain functions. But I do want, again, to have comments here because I'm sure there's something here that is obvious to me that is not obvious to you. Okay, cool. So let's just go from the first line down. Actually, first, could anybody else maybe give a better or differently worded explanation than I did? David clarified something very well. For the purpose of the slides, I didn't clarify. For the purpose of the slides, I have this broken down into 4 or 5 different slides. This is all representative of the same file. And there are places where I put ellipses to elide away code that's unimportant. So I'll show you the same function, but 2 different parts of the function where one will have ellipses above and one will have ellipses below. So what I'm trying to do is just show you very specific parts. But this is the file that we're creating up to this point. This would be how we would use it. That would be a different file. So var person equals module.exports. And I do want to clarify, you said normally the export's at the bottom and you override the exports. The problem with this is that occasionally you will have need to create a circular dependency. Usually that's a code smell, but sometimes circular dependencies are a reasonable thing. And Node allows circular dependencies, and Node, since it's file-based, it's very difficult to get around that at times because unlike other languages like Go and Rust, where you have a folder that things that are within the folder can be considered part of the same bits, you do want to separate things out into 2 separate files because there's enough difference of concern or whatever. And so there are cases where you'll end up with circular dependencies that are not because you did a bad design, it's just you're working within the limitations that you have. So if you assign exports to person, you will not overwrite the exports object. If you do not overwrite the exports object, then when there is a circular dependency, you will not lose the reference. Because a circular dependency, it has to make a decision. Do I do A first or do I do B first? And the way that Node makes this decision is it starts with A, it encounters B, it goes down B, it sees that B references A. At this point, it will take the memory reference, whatever module.exports is at that moment, and it will bring it over into B. And then it will continue down to fill out the rest of B, and then it will go back to continue execution of A. So if you follow this pattern, where you put the module.exports as the very first line and you assign it to your package, then you will not make the mistake of overwriting it. And when you come into a conflict where in a rare circumstance that you do have a valid circular dependency, your code is already well structured to handle that in the way that the Node require system is designed to handle it. Well, it's an in-memory reference that if it reaches the end of the file, it will use module.exports as you have defined it. It's only in the case of a circular dependency that it has to jump ship and then take whatever the reference is at that time rather than the reference that you end up with. But this can be very confusing because you won't necessarily get an error. I think the recent versions of Node will print an error to the screen. They won't tell you which circular dependency you have. It'll just say something like, circular dependency detected. Thanks. But yeah, so this particular idiom is to work with the way the module system works, which is, again, not the way that most people write their Node code. But this is, I'm all about, personally, I try to identify where are pitfalls and how can I write code that if I write code this one way, I eliminate a category of pitfall. And this is one of those things where It's a very simple thing to declare it at the top rather than at the bottom, and it makes all the difference in the world when you need it, and it doesn't harm you when you don't. So with that said, remind me your name again? Joanna. So Joanna, did that conversation clarify this for you, or is this still unclear? Yeah. It's just initialization values. So our package is person, and so rather than calling it this, which I find to be difficult to read, because if you grep through your code for this, there would be 11,000 instances of this. Whereas if you grep through your code for person, it's only going to show up the things that are in the person package. And so this is a naming convention that I use. Since we don't have a this anyway, I might call the copy that I'm making, I might go either way. I might call this P and this person, or I might call this person and this P. But one is the initialization values. If you follow there's a couple different schools of thought. I'll get to your question in just one second. There's a couple different schools of thought. One is that we should modify objects in the most, we should be cautious about modifying objects if it could lead to unexpected consequences. If a person passes in something to a create function, it is not self-documenting that you would modify what they passed in. The name create does not signify to the reader this object will be modified. So for example, if I were to pass in the same initialization object to my create function 10 times, if I don't follow that principle, I could end up with 10 copies that have all been initialized the same way, and then when I go change Bob's name here, I actually change Bob's name in all other 9 references. So that's why there's the distinction between the initialization object and then the copy of the object from which I am gathering information from the initialization object. Is that perfectly clear? Okay, if there's any ambiguity, let's suss it out. Phil, what was your comment or question? Yeah. So, there are times when I do it the other way, because I know it. I did a lot of build up. Say for example, I just pulled this out of the database. The way that we're going to use this is to interact with a model. So every time I call create, I'm calling create on something I just pulled out of the database. I'll just use the object that came out of the database because that's the way that package is designed to be used. But this is the safer way. This is more software engineers are going to point to this and say this is correct than the other way that I described because of the issue of potential side effects. David, you had another comment or question?
There were some JavaScript objects that you wanted to create new, and you had to use them, and sometimes you didn't. And the behavior and how that code works is pretty different. I'm just curious if this tree is something you would want to use or not.
So I want to eliminate new from the language. I don't ever want to use new because it is not abundantly clear how it will behave. And you also have issues of, for example, let's say that your create function needs to do something asynchronous. Let's say that you needed to, this particular case doesn't work out, but let's just work with me here. Let's say that you needed to, actually I have a good one in mind. You need to hash something, but you can't use the built-in crypto module. You need to use a separate module, say for bcrypt or something like that. And that is asynchronous. So you have two options if you follow the class constructor pattern. One is that your code is broken and you don't know when it works and when it doesn't because you need to do this hash as part of the object initialization, but you don't know when it's going to finish. So that's just pretty much right out. That's because you, in the pure sense of the word, are ignorant of the consequences. And the second way that you can do it is that you can add an init function. So now you're going to do, let me just model this out. So now you would be doing, say, var p equals new person, and you're going to pass in some initialization, and then it needs to do this hash function that's asynchronous because it's not part of the standard library that has the synchronous calls, or it's web crypto, excuse me, which is asynchronous and actually really slow and was a silly idea to make it asynchronous. And so now what you have to do is you have to call p.init and you have to await that. So your constructor has gone from the possibility of the alternative, which there's not that much difference, but it's just illustrative that it's not as intuitive. So you could have a person.create that is asynchronous, and this will work fine. Or if you try to use the new constructor, then you're going to need to create an init function that handles any promise or async functionality of that initialization. And I would say this isn't bad. I think it's all the other things about new that are bad. So yeah, is that clear? Okay. So it is super, super important that we are crystal clear, no questions or ambiguity about this slide or this slide. I think that we're there, but again, I'm going to give 10 seconds of opportunity if anybody has a final resting question. Ask now or be stupid later. I am not clear on the specific use case that you're talking about, but I agree that new has unintended side effects and sometimes it's hard to capture what's going on. Yeah. I think I had one other thought in that vein. I don't remember it. Maybe it'll come back to me later. Okay. So now we're moving on. And again, for clarity, I'm just going to go ahead and copy this over into this file so that we get the visual of this is what we're building out, is we've got our person package that has a create function and now it has a save function. So let me just go here where we're only looking at this. And I'm sorry this doesn't have syntax highlighting. The MD slides, the program that I use to build these, it's the dependency problem. It depends on some module that depends on some other module. One of the versions numbers changed and they switched the themes folder from one folder to another folder, which means that the other things upstream then have to know about that and they don't. And so if I built this on my other computer, it probably would have syntax highlighting, but because I built it on this computer where I installed a different version, it can't find the file and I didn't deal with it. So my apologies that we're just looking at black and white, which is a little bit difficult for code, but bear with me. Okay, so I'm just going to let this stew for a second. And well, I'll give a brief explanation and then we'll let it stew and ask questions. So my save function, the purpose of this is I want to save this, in this case, across the network. It could be to a database, doesn't matter. The point is that this is an asynchronous function and that this functionality does not need to be represented in the state of the object. It's not that important. When I need to save something, I know I need to save it. And so it's basically the difference of typing p.save versus person.save p. So for clarity, the way that I would be using this, just so we're super clear, is person.save p. And this goes back to what the functional programming guy, is it Chris? No, I don't remember his name. But the functional programming guy showed precisely this slide, the difference between doing p.save and person.save p. He showed exactly this. So this might be what you're familiar with, but then you are representing state that actually isn't necessary for what you're never going to display to the user this save function. So why add the save function onto the JSON when you could have the save function at the package level and just pass in your simple flat object. So that's the purpose of this. And then again, the mechanics of return, await, request, not that important. Fetch, request, database, save, whatever. Questions about this pattern? Yes, good sir, what's your name?
Jesse.
What's that?
Jesse.
Jesse?
Yes. With promises, is there a time when you decide I want to return the promise versus the value?
Yes.
Is there a distinction you make when
Yes, so first of all, I'm going to visually box this over here. This is a different discussion that we're having from this particular slide, which is perfectly fine. I just want to make the distinction that we're talking about something that's tangential but not.
And if you want to wait,
I don't.
back to it. I can get back
No,
to it.
I want to do this now because I actually didn't prepare. I should have prepared slides specifically on a bunch of promise use cases, but I did not. So this is perfectly fine. So let me reiterate the question if I remember it correctly. So the question is there a time when you want to return the unfulfilled promise or the promise as an object as opposed to awaiting the promise? One of the distinctions in this case, if I were to do return await versus return the request, you may remember one of my axioms was, oh gosh, let me pull it up real quick. It'll help me explain this, maybe, or maybe I'll just have it on my screen for no reason. Okay, oh, a little bit bigger. Return await or await without return. So I think this is an important distinction to the reader. Are you intending to return the value? If so, await it. Return await it. If you are not intending to return the value, await, but don't put return await. The reason that you don't put return and then the promise is that it's internal mechanics that might get optimized away at some point, but the stack trace changes whether you do return await the promise or whether you do return the promise. And in almost every case, you want the stack trace to be maintained as perfectly as possible. There are cases when you do not want the stack trace to be, well, it's not that you don't want the stack trace to be maintained. There are cases when the thing that you're doing would not lead to a perfect stack trace. So a stack trace is I did this, and then I did that, and then I did that. And much of the time when we're dealing with promises, we are following a very sequential order. We are literally doing this, and then this, and then this. But there are cases when you could think of, when would you not have a valid stack trace? What if you did two things in parallel, and then you did this? What would your stack trace show? Did the stack come from this branch, or did the stack come from this branch? We can't make a perfect decision on that, and so we have to lose the stack trace. So in the cases where you are doing, say for example, you needed to do 1,000 things. Now my rule of thumb, if you need to do 1,000 things or any number of things, my rule of thumb is somewhere between 2 and 4 things at a time. Because if you hit the database with 1,000 requests, then you're thrashing the network and the database. Especially if you're on a single core CPU, you're wasting more cycles and thrashing. So you almost never want to do something that requires a promise.all. Promise.all, I would say, is an anti-pattern. The quote-unquote efficiencies, I'll go into that later. I'll shelve that discussion. I want to muddy this discussion. But the cases where you have multiple things going on, such as batches of things where you need to do 4 things at a time, and you just want to keep that batch going. So every time one thing is done, you put another thing in there, and you're doing some sort of manual management of a collection, whether that's an array or a hash map. Those are the instances where you would want to return the promise itself. Or there are certain instances, you got to be really careful about this because it can make your code hard to debug, but there are certain instances where I guess it's essentially what I'm saying. You want to have something start, then you want something else to start, and only after both things have started do you want to wait for the first one to finish. So these are sometimes cases where there could be lock conditions. And I'm sorry, I can't come up with a code example to put that in a gist off the top of my head because it's highly specific to those rarer use cases. So I'd be happy to, if anybody wants me to, I can try to explain that a different way if that's not clear. Or I'd love if somebody else, if somebody has that question, if somebody else could maybe try to say it too. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, mostly.
Okay, what's left unanswered?
Part of it is so we have the case where we want to not resolve the problems right away, or there's very specific conditions. But you still need to manage when it's finished, you need to figure out that there's the ability to continue against that.
Yes.
How do you approach that type of problem?
So you are asking something that is incredibly specific that I have actually designed a solution for. So what I do for that is I created a function. So I have AJScript, which I am building. I'm actually trying to make it a subset of JavaScript to fulfill these goals that I've been spouting. And with AJScript, I add things to the extended standard library. So I have a promise._parallel. And this handles the exact situation that we're talking about in terms of it will handle a batch of things and then let you know when they are done. You could also, if your batch is small, you can accomplish this with promise.all. The problem with promise.all is what I said before. If you have 100 things to do, if you have 4 things to do, you can use promise.all typically without negative side effects. If you have 1,000 things to do, you need to batch it in some way to not have negative side effects, and that's what this promise._parallel does. And if you do check out AJScript, all of the functions that I create, they're all in issues right now because I'm drafting them out and trying to prototype, is this the right approach? But they will remain with underscores because the idea is one day the people in the standards body committee may wisen up and say, hey, this is something that is such a common use case, it ought to exist in the standard library. And I would not want to come in conflict with that, and no one is going to standardize something with an underscore in front of it. And so that's why it is this way. You see other utility libraries want you to require the library, but the problem that I have with that, again, sorry, I'm on a tangent right now. The problem I have with that approach is that then you're not scoping the functionality to a namespace. Remember, namespaces are one honking great idea. Let's do more of those. You're either having to create too many modules so they have a good namespace, or you do what I'm doing where you say, this really belongs in the promise namespace. That is the correct place where it ought to go, that is intuitive to recall. And so that's why I'm doing that there. So I apologize for the tangent on that. I hope that didn't muddy the waters too much. If it did, feel free to ask clarifying questions. But yeah, so you could use this function in particular to solve that problem. You could write your own function that has your own state management that works the way that you want it. This is a very, very generic way of doing it that I think would work for most people most of the time. So if you just Google AJScript on GitHub, it's under CoolAge86. If you're interested in this solution, it is available as a copy and paste. It is not yet published to NPM. At some point, I probably will publish a module on NPM that's called AJScript, and when you require it, it does the no-no of updating things that are namespace objects that exist in JavaScript. But if you buy into AJScript, then you'll buy into that. Anyway, so sorry, let me go back to this example. We're unwinding all the tangents now. We're unwinding the tangent about the promise batching. We're unwinding the tangent about returning a promise value or awaiting a promise value. And we're back at looking at packages and package level functions to control flattish objects. Any other questions? And we can go on a tangent again. I just don't want to make them happen myself if I can avoid it, because I do that a lot, and I know it's not helpful for people that are trying to follow one train of thought. I'm ADHD, so I follow multiple trains of thought. Literally, I am. All right. Seeing thumbs up, not seeing any questions. I'm moving on from this. I think this itself is fairly simple. Okay, so now what we have, again, is similar to what we had before. I'm going to go ahead. It's just one function I added into our constructor. So our constructor function now has a private, well, it's semi-private. It has private data. It has a new method. I'm adding a method onto the person object for a very specific reason. And I want to make sure this is clear. So if we're going classless, we need a way to represent private data. And so I gave the example here of a credit card. You don't actually want the user's credit card saved in the database. That violates all sorts of regulations. There are other pieces of data you don't want saved in the database, perhaps the user's password. Generally, we can handle the password in another path. But if we have the user's credit card, and we want to be able to pass around this one object, we don't want to pass around a user object and a credit card object, for the life cycle of this person, We may never call this method in other life cycles. Life cycle, I mean a code path that goes from instantiating until it gets reaped by the garbage collector. We may, but in some code paths, we want the ability to call this get credit card function. So in this particular instance, we're not even returning the credit card itself. We are shielding. If we did return the credit card itself, we're shielding ourselves from the problem of doing a JSON stringify and ending up with the credit card in the logs. So the credit card will not end up in the logs because it's a function. And when you JSON stringify functions, the functions are not part of what's stringified. So this gives us ability to hide information, to keep state directly on an object, and particularly this is the kind of state that we're not going to want to reinstantiate every single time. So I could now pass this person object around, and I could call p.creditcard. So let me go somewhere else, say, right here, p.creditcard. We'll say that we passed in some credit card info. Good old Visa Stripe there. So when I call this method at the right place, I will be able to get back some information about the credit card. But it won't accidentally leak in the logs, and it is not available to other objects or to other, well, I guess it would be available. It won't leak in the logs. It won't be serializable across the network. We're guarding ourselves here. So we can call this method and we're going to get back. In this case, I'm saying that the credit card is starred out, but it could just as well be that we need to make a call to Stripe and we want to be able to pass this user function. There's a couple things about security we could talk about maybe another time. But yeah, so this gives us the information hiding, and this is a clear use case where you'd want to hide the information, and the closure is what's providing that private data. So because the initialization object came in, now here I'm keeping a reference to it. I could have assigned this to a string so that that object could get garbage collected. If I was conscious of that, I could change this ever so slightly. So let me go back here. I could do var cc equals p.creditcard. And then we could do cc. This is a better implementation because that allows our initialization object to get garbage collected rather than hanging around. But minor detail. Is this clear? What questions do you have about this pattern? Yes? We could implement it either way. In this slide, I've done the ****, but we could implement it either way. We could implement it that we could get back the credit card or not. There's a tricksy thing that Douglas Crockford goes into that is better. So now we have new security context things in Node and in the browser, the special crypto objects that are opaque objects. It turns out you don't need to use those in the case that you did want to be able to show the real credit card. In the Crockford slides, there's actually a way to just use a normal object and create an opaque mechanism with it. I'm sorry, that probably sounds super abstract. I apologize. But just to know, there's actually a way to perfectly hide a credit card in JavaScript. I won't show it here because I won't, but it can be done. Yeah. So if we changed it, we could do this. Let me just comment this line out. We could do this instead, and I'll get to your question in just a second. And then we would return the credit card. And okay, I will show what I was talking about because it's actually not that complex to show. We could also we could create what we'd call an object key. I don't know what the name for this is. I don't know the technical term, but we could also we could do var stripe equals require. Oh wait, no, this wouldn't work. Never mind. The thing I was talking about, I don't know how to implement right here. So forget that I said that. I apologize. I can't implement that on the fly. Never mind. There is a way to basically have an object key, because every time you do object, it's unique. So if I do var object this and then object B this, those objects act as unique keys. They carry no information except for their memory reference. So there is a way that you could pass around an object that is a specific unique value that only exists in memory and has no exposed information. And then you could basically just check to see, do you get the secret object? And if you do, then you can release that to a friend class, so to speak. But again, I probably shouldn't have even said that because it's probably too tangential. So first we had a question over here, I think.
Yeah, just to clarify, so the reason you're not putting out RCC with the card inside functions for
So the reason I didn't do p.creditcard, the reason I assign it to CC.
right, because if you took that RCC and stuck it inside that person that credit card function,
Yeah,
it should accomplish the same thing, except
it won't.
you're back to the same problem.
Yeah, we're back to the same problem with the garbage collection. So we can initialize values that we want to copy to allow those other things to be released to the garbage collector. And you know, this is one of the things where I wouldn't worry about that too much unless you see you're having memory problems. Because when this gets reaped, anything that it had in closure should get reaped as well. And the garbage collectors get smarter all the time. That's a heavy area of focus. And so they do sub-optimizations where it might say, well, I can tell you're using this property of the object, but I can tell you're not using any other property of the object, so I'm going to keep this reference around, but I'm going to release the other things. Theoretically, they can do that. I don't know if they do. But this way, you would ensure that it gets released. Okay, and then we had a question. Oh, and sorry, remind me your name again? Jesse. Okay, sorry, I'm going to ask multiple times for several of you. And then we had another question over here somewhere. Okay. All right. Cool. Yes. It's Scott, right? Okay. Yeah, so you could do that. The use case of this is just to demonstrate that there's some amount of information. The last four could be used for verification, right? So maybe we don't even want to have the possibility for the last four to show up in the logs. Yeah. So yeah, you can look at it different ways. There's different reasons why you choose to do that. The demonstration here is just, this is a way to hide information. I'm going to provide another example that may help or it may hurt. You'll have to let me know which. But we could also have a person.set credit card. Let's say that we were to do that. And we could only create this at that time. Because if we only ever need the credit card when we need to set the credit card and we're going to pass this around, we could have that function not exist until we actually need it. And this would also be a valid approach. Oh, the closure part. The closure part is that we are passing in P. We are creating a new function, which is our credit card function. By the way, this is, okay, I'm going to answer that question, then I'll go on the tangent. So we're creating P, we're creating a new function, and then P is being closed over by this function. So this object is going to be returned from the create, and when it's returned, it's going to have this function. So this create is acting as a factory that everything that's happening in that factory is going to get cleaned up once this factory is done running. So when the create function reaches the return, anything that's not closed over inside the create function is going to go away. And in many cases, this is just a trivial side note, garbage collectors will actually look at the scope of variables, and if the variable never leaves the function, then it can do a eager garbage collection, because it doesn't need to put something out there if it can tell by looking at it that it never leaves. So it can actually garbage collect at the time that the return happens. Not saying that it will. These implementation details change all the time because they have performance trade-offs. But in Go, for example, they're very aggressive about zero latency for the garbage collector. So they do all sorts of performance hacks so that the garbage collector is collecting all the time at every available opportunity so that there's never a stop the world. In JavaScript, you do experience the stop the world as you start to use more memory. Stop the world meaning that everything in the program halts while the garbage collector does a sweep. The other tangent that I was going to mention is that this is actually not an anonymous function. It looks like an anonymous function because I didn't give it a name here, but it will actually have the name credit card because it's being immediately assigned. I have to double check that if we did person.creditcard.name, it would show up as credit card. I'm not 100% sure about that, but in a stack trace, which I believe would be using the .name property of the function, you would see credit card here. Because for a while, in general, you don't want to have anonymous functions. And so I would, in this case, I would do underscore CC or something like that. I don't know if I was doing that erroneously, but in all the modern environments that I've tried, in a stack trace, this will appropriately show the name of the function. So tangent, but just little nice thing to know, to feel safe about. Okay, anything else along with this example? Yes. You look like you're formulating a question. No, but you might be too. Okay. Welcome to the 22nd century. Now, all the modern languages do this. JavaScript was way ahead of its time, and I think that's part of the reason that it's become a dumpster fire. Because a lot of times when things are ahead of its time, anybody remember web TV? A couple people? Yeah. So web TV was, well, it's just a normal TV these days. It literally is just a normal TV today. But it was so far ahead of its time when internet speeds were so bad, it didn't really make a lot of sense to have a smart TV. But it was smart TV. And JavaScript is kind of a smart language. And it had so many features that were not prevalent at the time that JavaScript was made. And people were really uncomfortable with that. And that's part of the reason that we have this schism where everybody wants JavaScript to be something else. Because people that came from these other languages, they have a hard time adopting these types of patterns. To me, I'm a native JavaScripter. This is how I grew up. So to me, the idea of true, pure object-oriented programming, where you're just using objects and closures, and you can literally create anything that you need, and the amount that I have to learn in order to do that is this much, except for a couple of those special cases, but pretty much every single special case is in the Douglas Crockford talks, and since I watched those within the first 6 months of beginning to learn JavaScript, I've known all of the intimate details of every weird thing you could do with an object pretty much from day one, because Crockford explained it all, and he explained it pretty well. But so to me, the idea of pure object-oriented programming is really, really simple and really, really clean. And I understand that some people may not ride that train. Obviously, they don't. But I think that if you're going to program in JavaScript, you get a lot of benefit out of following the way that JavaScript was designed by the designer rather than following the way that it's being modified by people who don't like it. Speaking of which, I have seen some horrendous Go code. And you cannot be dumb and write bad Go code. You have to be smart to write bad Go code. Okay. Now this one is the same thing again. We're just showing a different use case. Whoops. So it's the same thing. We're just showing a different use case. It's a little bit more dense. So here, this is a really common pattern. You're going to have some sort of request object. You're going to need an API key for that request object. And you don't want to always have to have access to that API key. API key, like the credit card, you don't want it to leak in the logs. You don't want it to be pervasive throughout your system. You want it to be contained. So this is a utility method that can create an API out of something that can make requests, an API object, an authenticated API requester. I'm sorry, I don't know what create API request. That's exactly the right name. So it will create an API requester. It actually should say requester, not request, because request would imply that it is making a request. That is a misnomer. That's a mistake. It should be create API requester. So this will return a function where if I give it the data that we're assuming that we only do get and post in this simplified example. If I'm returning a requester function, which this I should have given a name, because that is anonymous as it stands, which is a bad idea because then it would not show up properly in stack traces, and we want things to show up properly in stack traces. But I'd be returning a function that closes over the secret and the key and passes those to the auth. So the way that I could use this, I don't think I actually showed the use of this, but I think I will because that's kind of important. Let's say in my person package, I had person.request. Whoops, that's not what I want to do, sorry. I'm gonna put this utility function down below. I hope that doesn't scare anybody. I'm just gonna put it down below. So there might be, this is not necessarily the cleanest implementation because this is creating something that is, it's not global, but it's to the entire package scope, and we might want to be able to create multiple instances of a person requester. But for simplicity, we're just going to go with, I'm going to pass in an API key and an API secret. So maybe it's, say, process.env.API key, API secret. This kind of defeats the purpose of what I'm trying to show since I'm using a global object to show it. But hopefully this is not to the detriment of the example. So we could create, say that we've got a person service. The person service has an API key. We can create an API requester. So some of you have used interceptors in other request libraries, such as Axios or something like that. This is turning the interceptor pattern from an inheritance style pattern to a composition style pattern, essentially. You're taking things that you could just shove them all in a bunch of state class, or class state, and you're making it so that you're composing over the functionality and wrapping in a closure. So now I have a person request that I could call person request, sorry to be live coding here, but let's just say it's URL API persons save, and we're going to give it our JSON is going to be a person. So this is these lines are not the way that they would necessarily exist in the code. I'm just trying to demonstrate this. So feel free to ask questions, and if this isn't clear, because this would be somewhere in a different file. This one would right here. That's the usage. So I could create a request object that's scoped to the person API that closes over the key and the secret, and then whenever I use this request from the person package, I could pass in the URL and the data, and then it would either get that or set it. And I actually use a pattern very similar to this. It's a few more lines of code, so I didn't put it in the slide, but this is how I create APIs. And I love it. If you don't love it, there's plenty of room to fight right here. So let me go back to the original slide that's a little simpler, maybe, now that I've explained that. And I just want to give an opportunity for any questions. Again, should be pretty much the same as what we just went over, just a different application of it. So it's a requester. It's called create API request, but this is a misnomer. It's a typo. It should be create API requester. So we're we're creating a function, and are you familiar with the request module? Are you familiar with Axios? Okay, or http.get. Okay, so imagine instead of this being called request, imagine it's called axios.get or axios.post. Does that clarify what this is doing when I word it that way? It's not making the request, it's making the requester. It's making a function that has the API key and secret information in it. So when I do call it, that information is already there. So this one doesn't specify. Oh, whoops. There's two typos in this. I'm sorry. This is missing the URL parameter as well. Sorry. So this should also have URL, and this would probably be something more akin to this, URL and data. That's probably confusing. My bad. Does that clarify that for you? So we could close over the URL. In this case, we're not. This is a usage of that. So as a usage of that, I would want to pass in, and I'm actually doing this wrong as well. I'm not actually following the same API that I outlined there. Now I'm following the same API. So this function, I'm going to call this requester, just so it has a name, since in its current state it is anonymous. Although when it gets here, it will be called request, but for goodness sake, I'll put that there. So now we're passing in the URL, and we're passing in ostensibly a person object P, and then this request function is the request function that's being returned here. It's this requester, which when this is called, it already has the key and the secret data. So then at that point that the requester function is called, the request function is called, and then it has the data that we passed in before. This is also called currying. Well, it's not really currying, but currying is another name for this. It's using closures. And then we're passing in the new information that it didn't have yet. So it's another method of information hiding. Is this clear now, or are there other questions about this? Because I do realize I made some mistakes in the slide. I apologize. Phil, you look confused. No? Okay. You're just straining. Okay. All right. Well, I see most people on their phones or computers, so I'm going to take that as a sign that we need to move on because this is boring at this point. We've hit it over the head. Okay. So, next bit. Oh, what time is it? So I'm just going to wake up a little bit. Do a cartwheel. No, I'm not going to do that because I'm over 30 and my ankles won't heal if I do anything wrong to them. Okay. So, array methods. Don't. Best advice you've heard all day, aside from all the other advice. Remember what Phil said. I am the best Node.js developer in the world, and I will not contradict him on that. I've not met one better. So what I mean by that is it is better to be absent of semantic information than to portray the wrong semantic information. So if I tell you open the door, and what I mean is get on your bike, that's very confusing. Why would I say that? Oh, you probably can't see. That's Arnold Schwarzenegger. Your reduce is too powerful. So specifically, reduce is the #1 culprit in this scenario. And first we're going to talk about what reduce is, and then I'm going to go back to that previous point. So reduce is, I see people use reduce all over the place for everything, and it honestly makes me angry. I'm a very weak person. I don't have good emotional control. I can attribute some of that to ADHD. The rest of it, I don't know. I'm just a bad guy. But reduce is for lossy aggregation. That's the semantic meaning that it conveys. And what does lossy aggregation mean? When you are using reduce, what you're communicating to someone who knows what reduce is, which is me and, I don't know, probably one other person in this room and 5 people outside of this room, what you're communicating is that you want to take something and make a final result out of it where the sum of the whole, the result that you get, cannot be represented accurately in its component parts. And so the perfect use case for this is for the primary use case of what reduce is, which is to add things together. So if we add the numbers 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 using the reduce, which is a perfectly fair way to do it, then every time we receive the total, which I also made a typo here, there should be a 0 right at this point. It doesn't actually matter in the case of numbers. It matters with other things. It happens to not matter with numbers because it works out with numbers. But generally, you need to put an initializer or an initial value in your reducer, your reduce function. If you don't, weird things can happen. You can get unexpected bugs where only 4 of the 5 values are being done what you think they should be done with. So my bad there. But if you add all of these together, in each iteration we're adding, well, in the first iteration we actually end up there is no first iteration in this case because I didn't put an initial value. So it skips ahead to the second iteration. So it starts at the second iteration where it gets the total of 5 and the value of 4, which makes 9. And then in the next iteration, it gets 9 and 3, which is 12. And the next iteration, it gets 12 and 2, which is 14. And the next iteration, it gets 14 and 1, which is 15. So when we get the result 15, we cannot tell from that result what the inputs were. If you can tell from your result what the inputs were, then you suck at writing reduce functions. And I don't like you doing it, and I want you to stop. Please, because you hurt me, and I don't have good emotional control, so you're responsible for my emotions rather than me being responsible for my emotions like a real adult. But hey, that's half the tech community, so I feel justified. All right, so is there any question about that? Yes.
Cool, but
Okay. Think about this. Okay, so you're saying that reduce was originally a filter function. Okay, I might be incorrect on that one. I put myself out. No, I may be totally incorrect. My understanding, I don't come from a functional programming background. And my understanding is that reduce is to communicate a lossy aggregation. But I could be wrong. So if I'm spouting falsehoods, all the more reason that I'm proving my point. It is better to have no semantic information than bad semantic information, which is why I put the ixnay on reduce, and I call it out specifically because I don't know that I've ever seen someone use it correctly. I don't think there's really that many needs to use it, because if you're going to use filter, just use filter. And if you're going to use find, then use find, and so on and so forth. It is hard to read even when you do it right. I agree. So there's all points against this, and there's a, I don't think I show it. No, I don't. I don't think but there, in one of the talks, specifically, Rob Pike calls out functional array methods and says that it's more cognitive load, it's more things you have to remember and discern, more work for the reader, it's more one of those high context things, and also it's more difficult to optimize at runtime correctly. If you write the loop to do what you actually want it to do with the performance characteristics you actually want it to have, then you will get the performance characteristics that you actually want. So this is a convenience function that is confusing and detrimental to performance. Why would you use it? Now in JavaScript, that's not always the case because JavaScript is just-in-time optimized and it does some weird stuff. And things that have no business being faster than something else will be. And moreover, changing an unrelated part of the code. Say you do an allocation on an array in one function and you change that to have the array pre-allocated. That could make a completely unrelated function faster or slower. The JIT optimizer it seems to me to be chaotic in nature. You cannot predict what it will optimize and why, which is why I advocate against performance hacking in JavaScript. It's really easy to get a micro benchmark to say what you want it to say if you experiment enough or if you know some of the internal implementation details. But those details vary all the time because the people who are at Google who actually deal with web servers and web pages are always making tweaks to the optimizer to match the use cases that they think are the ones that ought to be preferred over others. So that's its own tangent, sorry. So getting back on track here, reduce is too powerful. We don't want to convey the wrong information. And so when in doubt, for each. And by when in doubt, I mean always. I don't really mean that. I do find filter and map for me personally, I don't care about the performance loss. I think, the thing is, sometimes I find that people don't know what map is. I think filter is really clear. Map should be clear because you're literally just mapping from one data structure to another data structure, but I find that sometimes that isn't clear. But for each is always clear. For each is very low context. You tell it what you want it to do, and it does it, and anybody come reading it along doesn't have to learn anything new, no matter what programming background they come from, unless you just do really, you can always abuse everything. There is no programming paradigm that is so well-founded that someone's cleverness cannot overcome it to make it do something it's not intended to do. But for each is, I believe, a bit more communicative in most cases because it just requires less fundamental understanding. So for example, this is something I see people use reduce for. This is a heck of a lot easier to understand. If you want to turn a collection that is array style into a collection that is hash map style, this function will do that for you. And I think that it is incredibly clear what this function is doing. If you use reduce to hack it to make this, you're not following the rule of a lossy aggregation. Everything that was there before is still there. You are just simply abusing the fact that you can use an initial empty object to then create the object in one less line of code. But you have the same number of steps. It's just harder to read because the initializer now comes on the next line and to the right instead of coming on the line before, which is where you would expect a value that's going to be initialized to be. Yes, Phil? What?
I said you have to be a genius to use reduce to do that.
It's the most common use case I see personally. But people use filter to do this. I mean, there's so many array methods. It's getting to the point that I'm just saying, okay, just cut them all off because there's too many of them. There's too much nuanced detail. It's too much to remember. It's too much to try to train someone on. Just use for each. But I don't begrudge you if you use methods in simple ways that convey semantic meaning. It's just that most people don't seem to understand what the semantic meaning is. They just reach in the toolbox, and when they find a double-clawed hammer, they just stick the claw on the screw and make it do. So. What's that? Yeah. there is an element of composability that is very nice. It's nice to be able to encapsulate some functionality and be able to pass that functionality to something else, which is what these array methods essentially allow you to do. They allow you to write code that is more concise and that can be very readable if you use them judiciously. To your point, the for, if you do classless programming, I don't believe you run into that problem. So the problem that he's speaking about is JavaScript had for, and then for each was introduced. And then there's been this battle between people on the committees, because there's 3 or 4 different committees for JavaScript. There's TC39, there's WhatWG, there's JS Foundation, there's W3C, is that what it's called? There's probably another 1 or 2. So there's these competing groups, and inside of the groups, they kind of spite each other. So one will standardize a new array method that will be, so iterators is the perfect example. Iterators are a feature that come from functional programming. I'm not going to go into what they are. Just to say this, iterators make perfect sense to use with iterator methods like map, for each, etc. That's literally, they come from the style of functional programming. And yet iterators in JavaScript don't work with the functional methods. They only work with the declarative methods, which is, it's like you're eating Chinese food in a Mexican restaurant. It's just so absurd. Unless you come from Duchesne, in which case you do that all the time. Yeah, Duchesne. Anybody come from Duchesne? Has anybody been to A Star in Duchesne? Okay. Well, I had a shot. There's a Chinese restaurant that serves Mexican food. Okay. So, yeah, I think any other question about this? I hope this is clear. I don't think this one's an advanced topic per se. All right, moving on. So in this vein, we want to, generics are bad. And if you don't know that, get out of here. Generics just, they don't have a place. And if you watch the talk on the road to Zig 1.0, which is a talk I highly recommend, it is on creedsofcraftsmanship.com. This is, the way that you get around generics is explained really well. Of course, it's not implemented in very many languages. It's kind of just Zig that does it. But Go, instead of generics, Go has generators. And JavaScript, all dynamic languages, I'm sorry, I'm skipping around a little bit, my apologies. Focused again. All dynamic languages have generics by default. Generic just means that any function can handle any type. So dynamic languages, JavaScript, Python, Ruby, any function can handle any type. That's called generic. So anytime the compiler actually needs to run the code, it will create a copy of the code depending on how you use it. So if I have a sort function that operates on numbers, then it'll create a copy of that function in the JIT optimizer that's optimized for integers that seem to fit the pattern of what I'm passing in. If I also use that sort function for doing comparisons with, I don't know what else you can subtract other than numbers. If we were to look at something that has a dot length on it, there'd be different types of objects that could have dot length, like arrays or buffers. So the compiler will actually create a copy of that function for each thing that it needs to optimize. So that this function's optimized for buffers, this function's optimized for arrays, this function's optimized for whatever it happens to be. And this is goes into duck typing. It doesn't matter. The point being that this dynamic feature of languages is what leads to lots of useless abstractions. This is the point I'm getting to. Forget the things I said before. Refocused. This dynamic feature leads to lots of useless abstractions, things that are shallow and things that sometimes lead to poor optimization characteristics. Particularly, I'm talking about things like Lodash and syntax sugar that we want to avoid, as well as just confusing semantics. So the title here is not quite right, but I'll explain that in a second. So left pad, I imagine many of you have at least heard of left pad, if not regularly use it on the daily. This is the epitome of a useless abstraction, well, along with most of the Lodash as well. But left pad does something that JavaScript already does. Every string has a pad start method. There's no need to have a left pad. Now, granted, literally 10 years ago, or 10 years ago-ish, when left pad was created, this had not made it into the language yet. It's something that you could have polyfilled easily, but it wasn't in the language yet. And I think they called it pad start because there were so many implementations and things like MooTools that would modify string prototypes that they sometimes chose stupid names, not because they're stupid in this particular case, but because they were trying to avoid conflict with other people that were being stupid. So instead of being called left pad, which seems pretty natural, it's called pad start. And yeah, so you don't need this. It's a useless abstraction. It's just, we already saw this before. And the other thing that I was going to say about this is let's say that you actually needed a left pad. Let's say that function didn't exist, because there are lots of similar functions that are two-line functions that don't exist in the language. You know what you don't need to do? Install 1,000 different modules that have these two-liner functions. You can just copy and paste. So I keep a cheat sheet. If you ever watch me on my live streams, I reference this quite often. I go to my cheat sheet, and there's my Go cheat sheet, because I was working in Go code recently and I added something to it. So if I go to, let me search for Node here. Let's see if this will pop up. It should be on the first page, but sometimes it does BOGO sort, which is kind of appropriate considering that the first thing on the list is BOGO sort wins. I was doing some JIT optimization hacks to see what would happen, and basically what I discovered was that random happens. There's no predictable way for the problem that I was solving to tell what change you make will have what result. Okay, I'm just going to go to the Go one because that one's right there, but I have a Node one that should just be on the second page. I just don't want to go find it right now. So I have my cheat sheet. This is, when I need to do my build tools package, there we go. I just copy and paste this. When I need to do base 64, because I don't have that on the tip of my fingertips all the time, and some of you that are using VS Code or something like that, I can't stand that when I hit dot, stuff pops up in my face. I can't do it. It's too distracting for me. I can't use something like GitHub Copilot or VS Code Smart Completion. It messes with me to have things popping up all the time. So I realize that this kind of thing you could do with those tools, but for me, I have a lot of things like that just in my cheat sheet of, oh yeah, I need a random reader. I need to parse fractional seconds. These are things that, hey, I need to do commonly enough, but they're not in the standard library and they feel so small and so otherwise useless that I don't want to create a package for them. So I just copy and paste them over. And I think this is a good way to do it. And if you got some stupid little function, just keep it in a cheat sheet and copy it over when you need it in a project. It's going to be fine. And then you don't have to worry about what happens all the time with NPM where somebody just hijacks a module or sabotages their own module and just puts weird stuff in there for whatever reason. Shallow abstractions do nothing to fight against complexity. We talked about this ad nauseum. But, Lodash.map. Why? Array.map. And then explicit over implicit. I consider this a useless abstraction. Some people might disagree. Again, you're wrong. But the nice thing about a free country, the most important thing about a free country, is that you're free to be wrong. If we can't have that, war and bloodshed. So, this is not communicative for a number of reasons. One, I'm guessing it's because of some other bug in the language. They put the ellipses on the wrong side. So in any other language that has ellipses like this would be collector syntax. And then if you want to do expansion syntax, the ellipses would be on the other side of the array. So that's not clear in of itself. The syntax is incoherent. And this is just a lot clearer. This is how you copy an array in JavaScript. This is This says what it does. You're taking a slice from 0. It's a copy of array. Similarly, you notice that I have not up to this point shown you any arrow functions. I don't know what person thinks that this is easy to read. I've met somebody who is a math major who prefers everything to be on one line with one-letter names and with symbols. But I don't like that. Oh no, it's 3 lines long. Oh no, what are we going to do? But I can tell what it is. It's a function. I did see on some of the information that came in, I think that Phil sent me, there were some questions over when is something a constant and when it's a function? And in what language would you have that question? Is this a tyrannosaur or is it a bicycle? That's not a question people have, except in JavaScript, right? And of course, I'm not making fun of the person that's asking the question. I'm making fun of the situation that arises that makes it necessary to ask the question. So, if you want to learn JavaScript to read other people's code, I'm sorry, I'm not going to be of much help to you because you need to learn about 1,000,000 billion different syntaxes and ways of doing things. My goal is to help you for yourself and your team to personally be able to have a better experience with JavaScript. And, you do whatever you want. Again, don't have good emotional control and might get angry. Okay, so don't tell me. I don't want to know. If you do it that way, I don't want to know. I don't want to know. We can be friends. Well, we can be friends even if I am angry, but I don't need to know. But yeah, and there's other things that I'll get into momentarily why this turns out to be incredibly adding ambiguous syntax that so many things wrong. Okay, moving on. Why I'm frustrated now will come up a little later. Okay, ternaries are the devil's playground. Proper languages don't include them. There's no ternaries in Python. There's no ternaries in Go. Languages that have a Zen or a Proverbs or whatever, they don't have ternaries. People that care about writing readable code, the ternaries are not necessary. Again, I get it. It's convenient. Every single page of React documentation is littered with nested ternaries to the nth degree. But you know in your heart, you get confused. And I do too. Everybody does. Nobody likes them. It always feels, oh yeah, I'll just put a ternary in here, it'll be fine. And then, what the heck is this doing? Why are there 3 question marks in a row? What was this supposed to be this way or that way? Which side was the truthy one? Don't do it. Another thing that I don't see too often, thankfully, but you see in React a lot, well, so I guess I do see it often, is getting nested templates. Now, the example I gave here is absurd, but it illustrates the point, because if I were to create a real example, then I'd have to get more lines in there and have more variables and have some functions defined and yada yada. But don't do this, please. Please, for my sanity, for your sanity, you'll love yourself more, other people will love you more, or I will personally refund you your money. And this goes back to if it sounds cool, don't do it. Okay, this is the #1 red flag in the office that people know that I'm coming for them. If I hear, oh, that's cool, I immediately turn around, I go look at the code, I say, I'm going to get this before it goes to review. Because, oh, that's cool literally translates to, that's not intuitive, I would not have understood it except for that you're showing it to me. This is something that I would not have been able to guess or learn through the normal means. That is literally what people are expressing when they say, oh, that's cool. Yeah? I don't even know what that means, but yeah. Yeah. So anyway, this is the good way to do it. It is easier for people to read from top to bottom than from left to right, and certainly than from right to top. So I talked about the right to top was the reduce, for example, where the initializer is on bottom. So to understand what it's doing, you have to go read down at the bottom towards the right, and then you have to go back up towards the left at the top. Anytime you have to make a zigzag pattern to understand something, you are doing it wrong. And this doesn't particularly show that, but it's just the general principle of it's easy for us, because of evolution or God's design or whatever you want to call it, it's easier for us to read from top to bottom than from left to right. So Yes, more lines, mo better. I mean, we don't need to senselessly create lines, but this is clear. Unless you disagree, in which case, I'm just going to move on. Another thing, this falls under useless abstractions. I get that for all of 6 days, Yarn was really cool and really controversial, and it got 100 million retweets. And then on the 7th day, NPM publish happened, and then NPM had all the same features as Yarn. And to this day, I don't meet people that say, oh, I have problems with NPM, unless they're using Yarn. Because the Yarn people are always, oh, yeah, I can't get this to work with NPM. Really? What's wrong? I don't know. I just use Yarn. Well, duh, it's not going to work with NPM. If your Yarn has screwed up your package file, then you need to rebuild your package file. This is not NPM's. NPM did not create this problem. You know, but I get it. Occasionally a third-party tool will introduce a new feature ahead of the first-party tool. I take the wait-and-see approach. Usually the first-party tool is going to take the same functionality and add it in because people are demanding it. People know it's a problem. Everybody's got their schedules, their resource constraints, their timelines. Yeah, NPM couldn't get the caching implemented that week, right? But now you got people that are stuck on Yarn that can't figure out what they're doing. They don't understand what's wrong with their package file. All they know is, well, I got to keep using Yarn because otherwise I can't get things to build anymore. I don't really know what PNPM is, but people have mentioned it to me recently, so whatever. But unless you've got a really good use case, Lerna is something I've heard about as well. Just stick with the standard tooling. Now I'm going to make a hypocrisy. I'm going to do a thing that's against what I just said a little later on. All right, number 5, we can breeze through this. Oh, first of all, any questions about this useless abstractions bit? I know what I'm saying is controversial. I will hold restraint and allow you to express yourself freely, as is your God-given right, and not take that away from you as a selfish, evil person, but be a good person, and let you disagree with me if you so shall. If you have a reasonable case, or if you have a comment. I just want to pause to finish the section, kind of. Yep. Yeah, so for those of you that don't know, npm install is actually for an alias for npm install -- random. The two do exactly the same thing. They install any version of a dependency. I have no idea what happened there. It's one of those backwards compatibility things where they won't fix it. So if you don't know about npm CI, that is the most, maybe the most important thing you learned today was npm CI. Yes, Lauren. That's because you're using Node. I need another Mountain Dew before I can answer a question like that. I'm sorry. I'm not going to go into that right now. If you are running Node, you should not be transpiling. Now that said, I guess y'all are using TypeScript, so what I said is invalid for you because you're not using Node per se. You're using a transpiler that then uses Node. Those are problems that, honestly, to be completely honest, I just don't have the energy for that right now. Maybe after we eat something. But I don't care. I know you actually want a real solution to your real problem, and I do want to help you with that. But to me, this is a nonsense problem. It worked, but we decided to break it. Not you personally, but the people that are designing these tools that break things. And I don't have a good solution for that because that's not JavaScript. That's not my area of expertise. So ask me again later after we've had lunch and I'm not so cranky. All right. And I guess, let's see. We might go through this real quick and then take a survey of the next ones. Phil, when do we want to do lunch and how much longer am I here for? At 12:30. Okay, so we're waiting 45 minutes. That's too bad because it's there. It's not getting any warmer or colder. Okay, that's fine. So I want to make sure that I leave plenty of time for us to discuss whatever real problems you're having. So I think I'm going to breeze through the rest of this and just kind of lightly touch on some things that might spark some conversation. And I want to leave time to just bring your questions. I'll do my best to answer them, given the constraints of starting to get a little on the hangry side. And well, yeah, I might need to stretch my arms for a bit here because, anyway, I'll go through this. So AJScript, like I said, I'm developing my own language. It is a subset of JavaScript, and there are some things in there that seem to me to be obvious. Oh, duh. 9 out of 10 developers are going to need this within the course of their monthly work in a way that's non-ambiguous. Because there's a lot of solutions where, well, there's 10 different ways we could color this. And there's a lot of solutions where it's, no, there's just one way we can color this. We don't need a bike shed. You're not going to get people in a room and people start disagreeing unless they're that one ignoramus I talked about earlier. So this is essentially the missing pieces on speed dial. So just to give you an example, the things that are in the quote-unquote extended standard library, as I call it, these are just copy and paste. There is no formal structure to this. It's all draft status stuff that I'm working through. But here's a function. How many times have you needed an ISO string that is relative to your local time rather than relative to UTC? This is a no-brainer. This is not controversial. This is not something where I was like, oh, that had a lot of extra CPU cycles. I don't know if we can handle that. We print out the letter Z. If we were to print out 4 more characters, well, that could explode the compiler. Nobody's going to say that, right? I don't know why we don't have to local ISO string. I don't know why we don't have that. But it's just prints out the ISO string, but instead of Z, gives you minus 0,700 or plus 0,400, and then gives you the time that it is presently where you are as the main string you see, and the offset is calculated according to UTC, so you get the time in the most useful format that you'd normally want it in. Also the format that you probably wanted it in the database if you're doing anything with times or calendars or whatever. Promise.sleep, we've got set timeout, but you can't await set timeout. They didn't update the spec for set timeout to do that. And if you're going to be using async code, it just makes sense to have a sleep function. I say it goes on promise because that's what I said. I don't know where else it would go. It seems that it belongs in the namespaces that exist. That seems to be the place to put async stuff. Same thing with for each. You need a way to be able to do things sequentially. In most cases, you're not getting a performance benefit by doing more things in parallel because the performance benefit that you're getting, what Node brought to the table was not that for a single user you do an infinite number of processes in parallel. It was that instead of having a thread or a process for each request, every function goes into an event loop, which means that nothing blocks. So the performance optimizations around people that think that there are cases where you get performance optimizations by doing many more things at once. But if you have more than one user in your application at a time, you're already doing multiple things in parallel. You're already getting that benefit. So if you want to handle 10 users at a time, you're not making your application any faster by then creating more parallel processes and putting them to a promise.all, because now you've got 10 users that each have 4 things they need to do. Now you're entering into the realm of either thrashing or just stacking up the queue on the event loop. So that's why I say for each, promise.forEach and promise.map. Promise.map because it would do essentially what all does except sequentially, where it returns the result set at the end, which is probably what you want more often than what you'd want with for each, although either could be implemented. Random int. Random floating point numbers aren't that useful. It's one line of code to convert it, but it's one of those things where you just do it so often, and it's in the standard libraries of other languages that you have a random function. You have a rand float, rand int 64. You can't do that in Java. Well, you kind of can with big ints now, but that's aside the point. Regex.escape, my nemesis. I'd love to tell you the story about that sometime. I don't want to do it now. Not because I don't want to do it, but because I value your time, and it's a tangent. For top-level package only, don't include in libraries. Oh yeah, so with AJScript, the idea is not that you would use that as a dependency and ship it out. The idea is that when you're writing your own applications, because I would never recommend that you modify global object. Well, never is a strong word, but very niche circumstances where I'd recommend you modify a global object or a global namespace to something as a dependency, because that's unexpected and just, you know, it's a little rude. You know, it's like walking into somebody's house without knocking, and you don't live in the boondocks where you just do that every day. You know, you wouldn't do that around here mostly, maybe. I don't know. But yeah, you get what I'm saying. Okay, nothingness. I'm going to breeze over this, but we can come back to it. I just want to breeze through this so that we have plenty of time to discuss, and this may be one of the things we want to discuss. You've got null, you've got not defined, which is different from undefined. You have the ability to delete, which will make something not defined. You have false, you have empty string, and you have 0. Did I leave anything out? Empty array is not nothing. Empty object is not nothing. They are both something. So just quick example, person.spouse equals null. Object is type of person. That's confusing. It's nothing that is something. That's confusing. Person.spouse is undefined, is now a something that is nothing. And delete person.spouse is different from person.spouse is undefined, because person.spouse is something that's nothing, whereas delete person.spouse is truly nothing, not defined. So the demonstration to see this would be if spouse in person, if that's undefined, it's true. If person.spouse, even if it's null, it's false. If you JSON.stringify a person, the nulls will come out, the undefines will not come out, and then obviously if it's not defined, there's nothing for it to iterate over in the first place. Where you run into a problem with this is if you have if spouse in person, this will result in true if something's undefined, unless you deleted it, in which case it's not defined. But if you do object.keys over person, the undefined thing will be in the keys array because it is defined as undefined. And then there's the weird things that I don't recommend, such as using the ellipses to copy something. This would copy the undefined values as well. So that's adequately confusing. I'm just going to move on, and we can come back to discuss it later if we need to. Also, we have nullish versus falsy. The nullish coalescer is something that you should probably be using fairly frequently, which is that if this person is a felon, if felon is defined as false, then this will not be true. It will remain false, because false is not nullish. Undefined and not defined are nullish, as well as null. Person.felon equals person.felon or true. If this is false, it will end up being true. Again, adequately confusing? Good. Const let var. I'm going to breeze over this. I do have a video specifically on this subject if you would like to watch it. This is one of my lamentations of JavaScript. There's no such thing as a const in JavaScript. This is because you could just, if you can change it, it's not a constant. Duh. That should be self-evident. But, you know, whatever. Standards bodies. If you are going to use a constant for the intention of using a constant, use it semantically correctly. Don't just throw const around. I mean, you do what you want. You live your best life. But why just throw const around? It's confusing. It's confusing to label variables constant. That doesn't make any sense. If it's not important enough to make it all caps, it's not a constant, right? By the way, if you didn't know, you can do underscores in JavaScript, as with Rust and Go. You can use underscores in languages, in most modern languages. Do you have a question? Oh, okay. Okay, let. JavaScript had blocks, but it didn't have block scope until they introduced block scope with let. So this is perfectly valid and it does nothing. I don't know why I showed you that. It's just interesting to know that this does nothing. There is nothing that is done here. And it's perfectly valid. Opposite case. Okay, I lied. You're right. The effect is nothing. There are no side effects of this. There is no, yeah, you get what I'm saying. We understand each other. Okay, let down. You cannot use let in case statements because they're technically not blocks. So if you use let in a case statement, you have to define an additional block. Otherwise, you can't let a variable in one case and then not let it in another. Or no, you can only let once per, it's confusing. The point is, this code will work because it's got these extra brackets that define these types of blocks that otherwise would do nothing. But it's completely unintuitive, and it's called the temporal dead zone. There are cases where let is Schrodinger's let. It's both defined and undefined. So whatever. And then, yeah, let me die. So this also does nothing in the same way that this does nothing. So this is actually a label, a go-to label, which is never implemented. It's just left in the language. Well, it also works for breaks. If you want to break out of a loop, you can break at different levels of a loop. But it's a label foo with a block bar with a statement baz. So when this is evaluated, nothing happens. This is particularly dangerous when used with arrow functions, because arrow functions allow you to specify a block. Well, if you look at a block looks like an object. So you would read it as an object, and then you would be unpleasantly surprised when the value of your arrow function is undefined, because it executed a block that had a label, that had a statement, and returned nothing at the end. So that was my earlier, var, it just works. There's no problems that I know with var. If you run linting tools, JSHint, JSLint, ESLint, the only possible errors that you could have with var, those already adequately catch. So there's no advantage that you get, as far as I can tell, neither performance, neither error management. It's more confusing to use const and let, and they don't seem to have any benefit. Other than that, if you want to write functions that are too long and are confusing to understand, let makes it easier to do that. Okay, await catch. My argument here is just don't trade one pyramid of doom for another. It is easier to read an await catch than it is to read a try catch, because with a try catch you have the problem of you're going down and left and right and zigzagging back as you're reading the code to figure out what's happening, especially as you start to do nested try catches. Then where you need to go to find the next condition that will execute could be anywhere in a set of lines that is below where you are and not related to where you are. Whereas if you use await catch, which would make perfect sense, because if you introduce async await and the await has a dot catch, why would you not use await dot catch, which gives you simpler code that's easier to read and lets you do better error management without creating any pyramids or, why did we solve the promise pyramid problem and then replace it with the try catch problem? This is confusing to me because async has a dot catch. I'm repeating myself. Again, we can talk about this more later. I just want to breeze through these things at this point. Async router. So if you're using Express, you will be happier with your life if you use async router. This is something that I wrote. I find very often the module that I'm looking for in NPM has about 3 stars. I think this one had 2 when I appropriated it. I fixed a bug in relating to error handling, and then I published it as @root async router. So if you want to see the video on that, I've got a video for it. It's very, very simple, easy to explain in a slide if you're familiar with how Express works, which this is something we may come back to. But essentially, you can use async functions if you use the async router, and this is not some third-party middleware that's doing some crazy stuff. It's literally a wrapper for the slide that I'm about to show you next. it wraps your function in essentially, I mean, it's not exactly like this, but it's in total, it's about 50 lines, and it's just wrapping the .get, the .post, the .patch, et cetera, it's just wrapping those functions in the express router in a composing way rather than an inheritance way, so it's super clean. And it gives you this same benefit of doing this as what you would have to do now if you want to use error handling and express properly. So let me go back. I think I need to go back one more. No, I must need to go forward one more. Okay, so here's express with async routing. You can use await. You can let it throw the errors because it will catch them in the express error handler. Again, these two things are the same. I know that I'm going through this quickly. We can come back and talk about it later. I just want to get through this so that we can decide what we want to talk about in more detail. But this one right here, they're the same thing. But this one, I'm having to do this promise resolve .then async function in every single one with the .catch in every single one. If I use async router, that's just composed around the existing router with all the existing functionality preserved, and then giving you just an easier way to do that. And then, a lot of people don't know this, but Express has a built-in error handler. And this makes it really nice because one of the axioms that I made up was let errors bubble until they burst. This is the place where your bubbles should burst. Your error bubbles should burst at the top level where the error handler is. You shouldn't have to have error handlers in 6 different places. You should have one top level error handler where everything can bubble up. And then in that error handler, you can do, in this I said if is safe. Say it's an error that we know is say a user put in bad form data. We know that's safe to show to the user. So we check to see is this error safe by some magic method, some duck typing. Then if it is, we JSON the error over to the user so they can get their message. And if we don't know what it is, I should have put a res.json internal error here. I forgot to do that. But we console.log it out to our server, and then we give them a obscure, opaque error that doesn't reveal any information that might have implementation details about the server or the security, etc. And the difference with this is it's error rec res next. And then this is the last bit I've got, and then we won't go into the tooling piece today. I think we'll just discuss, well, that might come up, and I might bring up some of the slides, but we'll just discuss from here. Pipe whenever possible. Somebody, one of the pieces of, I guess, what is it, pre-back? Feed pre? Stuff that I was told in advance is that there's some issues about understanding how to use buffers and streams in Node. Essentially, you always want to pipe from your input stream to your output stream. And what that might look like if I had a read stream that I was creating, then I might do my read stream, and I might pipe that to my express response object. So this would give me a streaming download for the person that has a browser, and this would guarantee that I'm not creating a memory leak where I'm reading from the file too quickly and I'm not giving it to the user fast enough. If I'm using .pipe, no memory leaks are possible because the TCP mechanisms plus the pipe mechanisms are pumping everything as it ought to be. And then never use data. There are some rare exceptions to that, but never use the data event on a stream. Always use the readable event. The readable event will fire basically the same as the data event, except that the readable event will only fire if you have read everything out of the buffer. So you figure out what you need to do with that buffer, and when you are done with it and you are ready for readable to fire again, then you call rs.read, and maybe readable will fire right then because maybe there's still data in the queue that's ready, or maybe it won't and it will fire when data comes. But if you use readable, you will not get memory leaks. Well, I mean, you could still create them. If you use data, you guarantee that you get memory leaks because your server will obviously be able to read faster from the network or from the database or from the file than whatever connection you have with the client. So you're guaranteeing that the fastest way to put things into memory is where you're storing them while you're waiting for the client, which is always going to be slower, to consume it. And then it's party time! Break time again. Okay, so with that, there was some tooling stuff I had to go over. I know I went over all of this really quickly from number 5. So I just want to take time to answer your questions and figure out what problems that you actually have. And if we want to go back to any of these slides, or if I've got another slide that I can use as an example, I'll do that. But presentation over. Yes?
So,
Remind me your name again? Jesse, yeah. Well, I don't. They said if I'm really good, they might invite me back. So.
Well, yeah. Axiom that let the errors bubble out, right?
Bubble until they burst.
Right. How does that portray against the rate catch?
Ah, yes. Okay, so I put this line in here and I didn't explain it, but let's explain that. So the purpose of a dot catch should be to correct or classify. So by that I mean, let's say that you go to create a new user. The user already exists in the database. Well, how could we solve this problem? Why don't we fetch the user by their email, and then why don't, instead of returning an error to the person, we could check the password that they tried to sign up with, and we could see if it's the password that they already have. So we could retrieve the object that already exists in the database. We could apply the same logic as if they were signing in rather than creating an account. That way, we correct the problem. We identify the problem, we use a heuristic to correct it. Classify would mean that there may be different types of errors that we want to present in a different way. So for example, I might get back a database error that is duplicate record, like I just described, or that is record does not exist, or that is a connection failure. So I would want to classify that error. Or with a file, I don't think this doesn't actually happen in Node, but this is a case in Go, which I'll just mention for reference because it works the same. You can get end of file error, which is not actually an error. It's just a condition that is guaranteed to happen in the success case. So what you can do is you can classify the error and say, well, if it's a duplicate error, then I just need to tell the user, hey, you already paid. This is a duplicate payment, you already paid. And I can, within the context of where that error happens, I can attach additional information onto it. I can say error.payment ID, error.payment URL. And so then when it bubbles up to the top and I'm checking my errors, I can say, okay, well, if it's a payment error, we'll give them the payment URL so they can see their statement. Because if they already paid, they probably want to see their statement because they were confused about paying, so showing them their statement URL would be beneficial, right? Or if it's a does not exist error, we don't want them to see Postgres database error at line 52. We don't want them to see that. What we want them to see is 404 not found. And so we reclassify the error. We catch that it's a database not found error, and we rethrow a resource not found error.
So I'm going to say something like that right.
Okay.
In the correct case, I'm actually catching the error condition and doing something that would be considered normal operation. So in that case, we're just returning whatever.
Yep.
In the classify case, I'm adding additional detail that the original throw function may not have had.
Yep.
But that detail will be part of the error that then I would rethrow at that point in time.
Yeah, so you could swap the error. You could swap the error and say, I don't want to rethrow the database error. I want right here, I want to throw the resource not found error. So you could choose to add more detail or you could choose to swap. The idea is just that if you are catching something at a lower level, the reason that you would catch it is not to silence it and brush it under the rug or to implement error handlers in lots of different places. The reason that you would catch it is to correct correctable errors. Usually these are idempotency errors, meaning that if you run the same process 3 times in a row, you would get the same result. Or you're classifying the error to give it some distinction, whether it's a different error or whether it's more information. And but yeah, you don't catch to silence or catch to terminate, except in rare cases. So for example, if you actually were doing payment processing, it would actually be very reasonable that you would have a specialized error handler in your payment processing route, because it might need to have very specialized information about sensitive information that you actually don't want the regular error handler to be responsible for. So there's exceptions to every rule, but this is, I'm providing as a guiding principle. Yeah, yep, certainly. I could go into more stuff, but I am suspecting that if I can get out of you your questions and your problems, I might be of more use than if I spout more information at this point. I mean, most of this stuff, this is the problem. Douglas Crockford said it in fairly exact words. Was it Douglas Crockford? It might have been somebody else. But it was, anytime something rides a line between discipline and creativity, that's when we need to be most concerned with these types of rule sets. Too many people feel that their creative expression is in the literal characters that they type. And I think that this is actually morally wrong. For a loose definition of moral. But I think that this is both technically and morally wrong. You should not be expressing yourself with the way you type the characters. The expression, the beauty of what you create is the functionality and enablement that you bring into the world that didn't exist before. And the way that you type characters on a keyboard is incredibly unimportant and the highest form of vanity in software culture, which I'm probably going to have to eat some of those words for my own vanity. But I mean, I am on a path to try to produce reasoned results. And when people argue with me and they have a rationale that they are able to articulate and I'm able to understand, I will yield to good rationale. But I think that we need to be disciplined. And if we choose to do something, if we choose to broaden our horizons in how we write code, we probably generally shouldn't do that because most problems have been solved adequately well and we have adequate tools. There are cases where that's not true because of, for example, standardization bodies running in conflict with each other, whereas languages like Python and Go and Rust, they tend to go in concert because they have leadership that goes in a particular direction shaped around values. But in general, yeah, I don't think that we should be creative in how we write code, unless you really want to do it for a personal project, you know, in the same way that you might scribble on a piece of paper. Sure, go ahead and do that, but not to put forth into the world to cause problems, I guess. I don't know how to say it. Probably use better tooling. So one of the main complaints I hear, and this could be a subconscious thing in your case, but one of the main complaints I hear is, oh, but I have to type more. Well, that's because you're not using your tools very well, right? If I just hit FU tab, you know what's going to happen? It's going to go function, right? So I don't know if that's you in your case. If you just like the visual style of it, my arguments in other languages, I might not have such a strong feeling about this one because it may be a language that's optimized for mathematical notation because the language is for that purpose. Well, but in JavaScript, we have the problem that you're overloading the lexer of the compiler. And if you're overloading the lexer, then by definition, you are also overloading people's brains. So I cannot use my eyes to do visual pattern recognition to concretely know what something is without stopping. Because literally the compiler has to stop, check an error condition, do a branch, see if it goes down that branch, if it results in an error condition. If it results in an error condition, it backs up, it unwinds the stack, and then it tries a different branch. So in JavaScript, it could be a function body, it could be a block, it could be a label, it could be an object. My brain also has to do that calculation. So that's the technical reason. Yes, I could get better at understanding those things, and most of you probably are far better at me than understanding that because your brain has had more time to train and do pattern recognition. So for many of you, it may be instant that you can tell which of those 4 conditions that it is. For me, I cannot, and I don't want to invest the time in training my brain to do something that I see as an exercise in futility, because you literally have created an ambiguous condition in the code that the only way to discover the condition is by finding out if you have an error. And this is one of the issues with semicolons as well. If you add a semicolon, it can actually change whether it's going to be evaluated as an expression or as a block. And that's Yeah, so I hear the Lambda case. My argument is this. It's easier to read from top to bottom than it is from left to right. Now, if you are using a stylizer that will put each of the chains on its own line, then I don't have too much argument against that. I personally don't like it, but that comes down to a matter of pattern matching because there is no error condition that we have to worry about when you're describing that case. It's not possible to create the error condition because we're not introducing the syntax that would create the error condition. So if you were to say that your formatter will recognize array, dot map lambda, dot filter lambda, dot reduce right lambda, then I don't have too much of an argument against that because the code is consistent. It's used within a particular use case that is semantically correct as a lambda, and it is readable because you are separating the concerns in such a way that it can be easily scanned. My Lexer is happy. Yes? JavaScript Jabber? Yeah, right now the website is messed up. He just migrated it over to a new platform as part of a rebranding effort. So you can't actually get to any of the podcasts as of this morning. Let's see if he fixed that, because I sent him a message. His name's Chuck. Yeah, so right now you cannot get to any of the episodes on the website. I imagine that he will fix that within the next day or two. Just part of a rebranding effort to essentially, I think it may have to do with people have been kifing episodes, so they will download the episode and then rehost it on another site, and it's been creating some brand confusion, and that causes a loss in ad revenue and some stuff like that. So he's doing a rebranding effort, I think, I actually might just be spouting out of my mouth hole, but I think that's part of it. He's trying to get things better aligned so that there's a stronger, clearer case of this is this intellectual property segment. Please do not steal. But it should be back up. So there's, JavaScript Jabber. And I actually, believe it or not, if you want to go back through the history, I am the person that created Utah.js. So far before JavaScript was cool, before anybody had any interest in learning it, I hosted the very first Utah.js meetup. Back then it was called UJSUG, for Utah JavaScript User Group, because I came from the Unixy background and we called things user groups, and then they switched over to call them meetups. And then I ran into, simultaneously, people who inside of their company were calling it the Utah.js lunch or JavaScript lunch or something. It was before Domo, back when it was Corda. They were running it, and I don't know where they went. Basically, all of us that were in it in the beginning, none of us are in it anymore. Probably because it's gone bat ape crazy with all the weird stuff. But yeah, so we joined forces. I changed the mailing list name to Utah.js, and then so on it goes. Well, if you use npm CI, you get pretty close. The only thing that's missing is that it doesn't necessarily verify. Well, it doesn't verify hashes Well, no, I think it does now. I think it verifies. You should be able to install from Git. Oh, no, we need to go on to the, I will bring up the other thing here because there is a really important slide on this, actually, in the other part. So we got tooling. There was a question about enums. There was that. Oh yeah, by the way, on webinstall.dev, Vim Essentials, if you use Vim, if you're not a Vim nerd, you'll like Vim Essentials. If you are a Vim nerd, you might not like it. But it's basically your IDE replicated in 30 seconds. I use it whenever I start up a VPS. Base tag is a cool thing. That's one of the things that's counter to something else I said. Mono repos. Okay, so let me talk about mono repos for a second, and then let's tie in this discussion because I think they're going to come together. So, mono repos. My question is why. I don't know why this is a thing. I get it in Google's use case. Google has a whole system unto themselves. Everything is path-driven. Like most companies that are performant and well-tuned, they don't really use third-party dependencies. You'll notice open source is really cool for all of us plebes, but the people at the top, they write their own daggone left pad function. They're not dealing with that crap, except for Amazon. Amazon doesn't seem to mind if their stuff breaks because of dependency problems. Anyway, so but for most use cases, I don't get the draw of mono repos, especially because we don't have to break things that already work. Mono repos seem to break things, especially with Node. If you're using a language like Go, a mono repo doesn't break things too much except for git tag, which if your stuff is scoped well enough, if it's an entire product, you could say, well, I'm git tagging the product. I'm not git tagging the individual functions or sub-packages. But in terms of JavaScript, it kind of breaks git tag, so I don't like that about it. Which means it breaks npm version, which means that it kind of breaks npm publish a little bit, and then it kind of makes npm, the package.json.homepage and package.json.version kind of weird. You either have to start managing that manually or use something like Lerna or whatever. So I don't like it, especially because it's not hard to add a submodule, and I don't know what the draw is between the two, because the complaint I hear is there's too many things, it's too much to manage. I have committed that sin. I've had people complain at me because I have a thing that's relatively the same package, but it has component parts that can be used independently, and I put it in 10 different repos, and people are ticked off. I get that. The smart thing for me to do, which seems like it would solve their problem, is if I just did git submodule add. So I don't know how this doesn't solve the mono repo problem, but I would be interested in hearing if there's something why this doesn't solve the mono repo problem, that we got 10 things that are closely related. We want them to really be together. I think that this solves that problem. I could be wrong. Also, private packages cheat sheet. So this comes in when we have issues of dependencies that are private, which I think is the primary use case for the mono repo, is we want to be able to get our private dependencies. We don't want to have them separate, because then if we have to install them, then we have to have authentication. Blah, 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 blah. It's terrible, right? Except that there is a silver bullet. So this is how you do it in local development. Basically, you just take your GitHub token, and then you set you set the token 3 times, once for HTTPS, once for SSH, and once for Git as the protocol, which uses SSH. The two are synonymous, but different syntax. But you basically just run this, and then you are able to install private packages. And if you want to be able to do that in the DevOpsy way, because the local dev environment is different than how you'd want to do this in a Docker or a containerized environment. It's not much different, but it's different enough that let a DevOpsy person do the extra 2 steps. But that is actually documented here. I had this problem, and so I went through, I kid you not, literally every possible way to do Git credentials. I don't believe that I missed any of them. This is a very thorough examination, and I came up with, out of all these possible ways to do Git credentials, that this way is really, there is no downside. This is the optimal solution with no downside for local development. And then there's another one. So there's 2. This one's called the simplest bullet, is the one that I just showed you. And this one is called the silver bullet, which is the one that would be appropriate for containerization. And the difference between the two is that one will store the token in a file in your local development environment, which would have to happen anyway. And the other one will allow you to grab the secret from one of the vault key things, which if you're familiar with the DevOps stuff, you know what I'm talking about. If you're not, don't worry about it. you'll learn when you learn if you learn. And you just set the get ask pass to use that environment variable, and then you have no security burden. Everything works as expected. So that right there is the key thing that when people talk about the mono repos and the dependency problems, I think is one of the things on the top of the list of things to look into. But did that help you, or was this not the right direction? So these are the two tools that I have in my toolbox. npm CI only equals production, which does not work in all cases because sometimes you actually need development tools to build. So if you were doing containerization, you might have a build step that does npm CI, and then after your build step, you would do npm CI only production, and then locally run npm audit fix. But I say, and again, this is maybe it's not really helpful for your case, get rid of the dependencies. What is that dependency actually doing? Is it doing something that you yourself can't adequately do? If it's small, just copy the code and put it in a file, maybe utils.js. Generally, I say don't name things stuff or utils. Sometimes for these little utilities, it's appropriate to have a utils module. So if it's just dumb little stuff that there's no, because sometimes people have a philosophy idea change. I've done this. They tick people off because they changed their function signature, but their function was stupid and it didn't do anything really that valuable. It's just, oh, this was convenient to be able to npm install rather than write those 4 lines myself. So I say copy and paste those lines if the license agrees to it, and just put a little comment above, copied from. There you go. Your legal requirement is satisfied. The legal department can be happy. No one's going to care anyway if it's only 4 lines. Plus, it's really hard to show damages if your project is open source because you're literally not charging for anything. So, but yeah. So that's, I think eliminating dependencies is a good thing to do. But to the point earlier about, well, do we ship this off and let someone else handle it? Is the person we're shipping it off to qualified to handle it? Because I have audited security libraries and been appalled. They're the most popular one-time password library in Node.js before I wrote my own. I understood the principle of the algorithm, and I understood how Node is supposed to work. And I looked in that code, and this is something that had tens of thousands of stars or whatever, or maybe just thousands of stars back then, or hundreds, whatever. It was the most popular one. People just used it willy-nilly, assuming that it was good. I actually inspected the code and found security vulnerabilities. I found that the person actually didn't know JavaScript because they were copying and pasting things like SHA-256 functions for a Node module. They're copying browser functions for a Node module. They would have had no need for them creating binary strings instead of using node buffers. I mean, it was just, the code was all over the place. You could tell that it was a copy and paste mess. It was Stack Overflow driven development. And this was a security module, right? So you have to also question, when I'm offloading it, am I offloading it to someone who is competent and able to fulfill my task? And then, I don't know quite how to say this, but that one guy, I think you can relatively say that he's not mentally stable, the one that sabotaged his own packages. He accidentally set his house on fire while his kids were inside because he had bomb materials. So somehow these materials that could be used for a bomb were present, and then the house caught on fire and his kids were inside. So you think, oh, well, this module's got literally millions, hundreds of millions of downloads every month. It's maintained by somebody who might have had a schizophrenic break or something, you know? So, I mean, that's extremely rare, but it just happened twice. Is that helpful, or am I just too out in left field for you? Okay, because I know a lot of times just saying, well, do it yourself. Well, duh, that's the problem I'm trying to avoid. I'm trying to not increase my own burden. Thanks, guy. You know, so I don't want to give you an unhelpful answer.